The antique shop on Blackwood Street had been empty for 17 years when Marcus Holloway first noticed the lights flickering behind its dust-caked windows. As the town's only real estate agent specializing in historic properties, he'd walked past the narrow Victorian storefront countless times, always wondering why such prime downtown real estate remained untouched while lesser buildings sold within months. The brass nameplate beside the door, green with age, still read, Cornelius Thorne, antiquarian, though most residents had forgotten the eccentric old man who'd once filled the cramped space with his peculiar collections. Marcus had heard whispers about Thorne's mysterious disappearance, how he'd simply vanished one autumn night in 2007, leaving behind no family, no will, and no explanation for the carefully arranged artifacts that seemed to watch visitors with an unsettling intensity. The building's ownership had fallen into legal limbo, passed between distant relatives who wanted nothing to do with their inheritance, until finally landing in the hands of a property management company that seemed content to let it rot. But now, as Marcus stood on the opposite sidewalk at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, he could clearly see a warm, amber glow emanating from the shop's interior, casting dancing shadows against the grimy glass that separated the forgotten world inside from the living one outside. His rational mind offered reasonable explanations. Perhaps squatters had found a way inside, or maybe the building's ancient electrical system had finally shorted in some spectacular fashion. Yet something about the quality of the light seemed wrong. Too steady for candles, too warm for electric bulbs, and entirely too purposeful for any accidental illumination. Marcus found himself crossing the street without conscious decision, his footsteps echoing hollowly in the empty downtown district where even the street lamps seemed dimmer than usual. As he approached the shop, he noticed that the thick layer of dust on the windows appeared undisturbed from the outside, yet the view into the interior was crystal clear, as if he were looking through perfectly clean glass into a world that existed in parallel to his own. The wooden door, which he remembered being secured with a heavy padlock, now stood slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of that impossible amber light that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. Marcus pushed the door open, wincing as the old hinges protested with a prolonged creak that seemed to announce his presence to whatever waited inside. The scent that greeted him was a complex mixture of old leather, aged wood, and something else, something organic and slightly sweet that he couldn't quite identify, but that made his stomach turn uneasily. The shop's interior appeared exactly as he remembered from his single visit years ago, when he'd briefly considered purchasing the property, yet somehow different in ways that defied explanation. The shelves still groaned under the weight of Thorne's eclectic collection, tarnished silver mirrors that reflected no light, porcelain dolls with eyes that seemed to track movement, leather-bound books whose titles were written in scripts he didn't recognize, and countless other objects that seemed to exist at the intersection of beautiful and disturbing. But now these items appeared more vivid, more present, as if they'd spent the last 17 years gathering strength in the darkness. The amber light had no visible source, seeming to emanate from the very air itself, casting everything in a golden hue that reminded Marcus uncomfortably of aged honey or dried blood. As he moved deeper into the shop, weaving between display cases and around furniture draped in white sheets that looked more like burial shrouds, he began to notice subtle changes in the collection. New items had appeared, or perhaps they'd always been there, hidden in shadows that no longer existed. A music box with a dancer frozen mid-pirouette, her painted face cracked in a way that suggested screaming rather than joy. A grandfather clock whose pendulum swung, despite having no visible mechanism, marking time with a rhythm that seemed slightly off from the heartbeat he could feel pulsing in his temples. A series of photographs in ornate frames, showing people in period dress whose expressions grew more distressed the longer he looked at them. Marcus told himself he was imagining things, that the late hour and strange circumstances were playing tricks on his perception, but the evidence of his senses was becoming harder to dismiss. The photographs were definitely changing, subtle shifts in facial expressions, slight movements in posture, as if the subjects were trying to communicate something urgent and terrible. One image in particular drew his attention, a formal portrait of a Victorian family, the parents seated with 3 children arranged around them. At first glance, it appeared to be a typical example of period photography, all stern faces and formal poses. But as Marcus watched, the youngest child, a girl who couldn't have been more than 7, began to turn her head slowly toward the camera, her eyes widening in what looked like recognition and terror. The temperature in the shop seemed to drop several degrees, and Marcus became aware of a sound that had been present since he'd entered, but that he'd unconsciously filtered out, a low humming, almost like singing, that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The melody was hauntingly beautiful and deeply unsettling, with harmonies that suggested multiple voices joined in some ancient lament. As he strained to identify the source, his gaze fell upon a glass display case he hadn't noticed before, positioned in the very center of the shop like an altar. Inside, arranged on black velvet, was a collection of what appeared to be vintage music boxes, each one intricately crafted and unique. But it was the largest piece that made his breath catch in his throat, an elaborate carousel with tiny horses that moved in endless circles, their painted eyes seeming to follow his movement as they rose and fell on their golden poles. The humming grew louder, more distinct, and Marcus realized with growing horror that it was coming from the music boxes themselves, their melodies interweaving in impossible harmonies that seemed to bypass his ears and resonate directly in his bones. The carousel spun faster, its tiny horses beginning to blur into streaks of color, and the other music boxes joined in with their own mechanical symphonies. The sound built in layers, each melody adding to a growing crescendo that felt both beautiful and threatening, like the approach of something vast and inexorable. Marcus tried to step back, to retreat toward the door and the safety of the empty street beyond, but found that his feet wouldn't obey his commands. The amber light was growing brighter, more intense, and he could see now that it was actually emanating from the music boxes themselves, pulsing in rhythm with their impossible song. The photographs on the walls were moving more obviously now, their subjects turning to face him directly, their mouths opening in silent screams or pleas that he couldn't hear over the rising mechanical symphony. The Victorian family portrait had transformed completely. The parents were reaching toward him with desperate gestures while the children cowered behind them, all of them looking directly at Marcus with expressions of absolute terror. But it was what he saw moving in the background of the photograph that made his blood turn to ice water in his veins. A tall, thin figure in dark clothing was approaching the family from behind, and though Marcus couldn't make out the face clearly, he could see enough to recognize the distinctive silhouette he'd seen in old newspaper clippings about the shop's previous owner. Cornelius Thorne was in the photograph, but he was also standing directly behind Marcus. The realization hit him like a physical blow, confirmed by the sudden cessation of all sound in the shop and the feeling of cold breath on the back of his neck. Marcus tried to turn around, but his body remained frozen in place, paralyzed by a terror so complete it seemed to shut down his voluntary nervous system. He could only watch as the reflection in the glass display case slowly revealed the figure standing behind him. Tall, gaunt, dressed in a black suit that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Thorne's face was exactly as Marcus remembered it from the old photographs in the newspaper archives, but wrong in ways that suggested death and worse things than death. The skin was too pale, almost translucent, and the eyes held a hunger that seemed to encompass not just physical appetite but something far more fundamental and terrible. "You've been watching," Thorne said, his voice carrying the same harmonics as the music boxes, multiple tones layered together in ways that human vocal cords shouldn't be able to produce. Standing across the street, night after night, drawn by the light but afraid to enter. "But you've entered now, haven't you? You've joined my collection at last." Marcus found his voice, though it emerged as little more than a whisper. "Your collection? What collection? These are just antiques, old things, curiosities." Thorne's laugh was like the sound of glass breaking in reverse, fragments of sound joining together into something that approximated humor, but felt entirely alien. "Oh, my dear Marcus, yes, I know your name, I know everything about you. These aren't just objects, they're vessels, containers. Each one holds something precious, something irreplaceable, the essence of those who came before you, drawn by the same curiosity, the same irresistible pull that brought you here tonight." The music boxes were spinning faster now, their melodies reaching a fever pitch that made Marcus's teeth ache and his vision blur at the edges. The photographs on the walls were no longer trying to warn him. Their subjects had given up, their faces settling into expressions of resigned despair that suggested they'd watched this scene play out many times before. The Victorian family was weeping now, the children clinging to their parents as they watched another soul prepare to join their eternal captivity. "You see?" Thorne continued, moving around to face Marcus while somehow managing to stay just at the edge of his peripheral vision, never quite coming into full view. "Death is such a crude thing, so final, so wasteful. Why let all that wonderful consciousness, all those memories and dreams and fears simply evaporate into nothing? Far better to preserve them, to give them a proper home where they can continue to exist, to experience, to remember what it was like to be alive." Marcus tried to move, to run, to scream, but his body remained locked in place as if his muscles had forgotten how to respond to his brain's desperate commands. The amber light was getting brighter, and he could see now that it wasn't just coming from the music boxes but from every object in the shop. Each antique, each curiosity, each seemingly innocent artifact was glowing with that same honey-colored radiance, and within that light he could see shapes moving, human shapes, trapped and twisting, reaching out with ghostly hands that couldn't quite break through the barrier between their prison and the world they'd left behind. "The process is quite painless," Thorne assured him, his voice growing more distant, even as his presence seemed to press closer. "A moment of transition and then eternal preservation. You'll find the company quite stimulating. I've collected some fascinating individuals over the years. Artists, scholars, adventurers, all of them drawn here by the same curiosity that brought you. They've been waiting so patiently for someone new to join them." The carousel in the display case was spinning so fast now that Marcus could feel the wind it generated against his face, carrying scents of dust and decay and something else, something that reminded him of his childhood bedroom, of safety and comfort, and everything he was about to lose forever. The tiny horses were no longer visible as individual figures but had become a blur of color and motion that seemed to be pulling at something deep inside his chest, something essential that felt like it was beginning to separate from the rest of him. "No," Marcus managed to whisper, though the words seemed to take enormous effort to produce. "I won't. I can't." "Oh, but you can," Thorne replied, and now Marcus could see him clearly in the reflection of the glass case, not the elderly man he'd expected, but something that had once been human and had become something else entirely through years of feeding on trapped souls. His face was gaunt to the point of being skeletal. His eyes were black holes that seemed to contain entire universes of suffering, and when he smiled, his teeth were too sharp and too numerous to belong to any natural creature. "You already have simply by entering. The door only appears unlocked to those who are meant to join us. The light only calls to those who are ready to become part of something greater than their small, fleeting lives." The music boxes were reaching a crescendo that felt like it might shatter Marcus's skull, and the photographs on the walls were beginning to fade, their subjects disappearing one by one, as if they were being absorbed into whatever lay beyond the glass and wood and metal that contained them. The Victorian family was the last to go, the youngest daughter pressing her hand against the glass of her frame and mouthing words that Marcus couldn't hear but somehow understood. "Don't let him. Don't become like us. Fight." But fighting seemed impossible when his body was no longer his own, when the amber light was pouring into him through every pore and drawing out something vital and irreplaceable. He could feel his consciousness beginning to separate from his physical form, pulled inexorably toward one of the empty music boxes that had appeared on the display case, a beautiful piece shaped like a small theater, with tiny curtains that were slowly opening to reveal a stage where he would spend eternity, performing the same brief scene over and over again. "Such a shame," Thorne murmured, though his voice now seemed to come from inside Marcus's own head. "You had such potential, such possibilities ahead of you, but this is better, really. This is forever. This is art." Marcus felt his knees buckle as the last of his strength drained away, but instead of falling to the floor, he found himself somehow floating, suspended in the amber light that had filled the shop completely now. The sensation was simultaneously peaceful and terrifying, like drowning in honey while fully conscious, aware of every moment of the transition from life to whatever came after. His vision was beginning to fragment, showing him multiple perspectives simultaneously: his own fading sight, the view from inside the music box that awaited him, the perspectives of all the other trapped souls who were watching his transformation with a mixture of sympathy and relief that they would no longer be alone. But as the darkness began to close in around the edges of his consciousness, Marcus became aware of something else, a sound that didn't belong to the music boxes or Thorne's inhuman voice. It was distant at first, barely audible over the mechanical symphony but growing stronger, the sound of sirens, multiple emergency vehicles approaching fast. Through the shop's grimy windows he could see flashing lights painting the street in alternating red and blue, and the realization hit him like a bolt of electricity through his fading awareness. Someone had seen the lights. Someone had called for help. The amber glow flickered, just for a moment, and in that instant of uncertainty, Marcus felt a tiny spark of his own will reassert itself. It wasn't much, barely enough to twitch a finger or blink an eye, but it was his, and it was real, and it was proof that some part of him still existed independent of Thorne's collection. The music boxes stuttered in their rhythm, their perfect harmonies disrupted by that single note of discord, and the photographs on the walls suddenly blazed to life as their trapped subjects began to move again. no longer resigned but desperate, reaching toward Marcus with new urgency. "Impossible," Thorne hissed, his perfect composure cracking for the first time since Marcus had entered the shop. "The process has begun. You cannot resist. No one resists." But Marcus was discovering that the human will, when faced with absolute extinction, could find reserves of strength that defied logic or supernatural influence. The approaching sirens gave him something to focus on beyond the hypnotic pull of the music boxes, proof that the world outside still existed, that there were people who might notice if he disappeared, that his life had connections and meanings that existed independently of Thorne's twisted preservation project. He thought of his sister in Portland, who would worry when he didn't return her calls, his elderly neighbor who depended on him to check her mail when she was away, the young couple he'd been helping find their first home, who would be confused and disappointed when he failed to show up for their appointment tomorrow morning. These connections, these small but real threads that tied him to the living world, began to pull back against the amber light that was trying to draw his essence into eternal captivity. The theater-shaped music box that had been prepared for him began to shake on its velvet display, its tiny curtains fluttering as if caught in a strong wind. The other music boxes were spinning more erratically now, their melodies becoming discordant and broken as the careful orchestration that maintained Thorne's collection began to destabilize. "You're destroying everything," Thorne snarled, his genteel facade completely abandoned now as his true nature emerged, not the sophisticated collector he pretended to be, but a predator whose feeding had been interrupted. Centuries of work, centuries of preservation, and you would throw it all away for what? A few more decades of meaningless existence? A few more years of aging and decay and eventual death anyway? The sirens were getting closer, and Marcus could hear car doors slamming, voices shouting, footsteps approaching the shop. The amber light was fighting to maintain its hold on him, but each sound from the outside world gave him another anchor point, another reason to resist. He managed to move his head slightly, enough to see the shop's front door, and realized with a mixture of hope and terror that the emergency responders would find the door locked and barred from the inside. Would they be able to break in before Thorne completed his interrupted collection? "Help," Marcus managed to whisper, though he wasn't sure if the word had any sound behind it, or if it existed only in his own fading thoughts. "Help me." The response came not from outside but from the photographs on the walls. The trapped souls who had watched dozens of others succumb to Thorne's influence suddenly found their own anchor points in Marcus's resistance. If he could fight back, perhaps they could too. The Victorian family stepped forward in their frame, pressing against the glass that contained them. Other photographs blazed to life as their subjects began to move with purpose instead of despair, and suddenly the shop was filled with a different kind of light, not the amber glow of preservation, but something cleaner and whiter, the light of souls refusing to be contained. Thorne screamed, a sound that shattered several of the music boxes and sent cracks racing across the glass display case. His carefully maintained human appearance began to deteriorate, revealing something that was more void than substance, more hunger than being. "You cannot escape," he shrieked, his voice now purely inhuman. "You are mine. You belong to my collection." But the emergency responders outside had found a way in, and Marcus could hear them calling his name. Somehow, impossibly, they knew he was inside. The shop's front door burst open, admitting a flood of normal electric light from the street lamps outside, and the contrast with the amber glow made everything inside seem suddenly less real, less solid. The music boxes were silent now, their mechanisms grinding to a halt as the supernatural force that animated them faltered. The photographs on the walls were fading back to normal, but Marcus caught a glimpse of the Victorian family in their moment of freedom. They were smiling, finally at peace, before they dissolved into ordinary pigment and paper. "Marcus, are you in here?" The voice belonged to Deputy Sarah Chin, someone he'd known since high school, and hearing his name spoken by a living person was like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. He tried to respond, to call out, but found that his voice still wouldn't work properly. The amber light was making one final attempt to claim him, pouring into the shop through every surface that had contained Thorne's collection. But the deputy's flashlight beam cut through the supernatural glow like a sword through silk, and where the normal light touched, the amber radiance simply ceased to exist. Marcus felt the terrible pulling sensation release its hold on him all at once, sending him crashing to the floor in a tangle of limbs that suddenly remembered how to move. The shop around him was changing rapidly, the carefully arranged antiques crumbling to dust as whatever force had preserved them through the years finally failed. There, Deputy Chen's light found him sprawled among the collapsing display cases, "I've got him. Marcus, can you hear me? Are you hurt?" Marcus tried to speak to explain what had happened, but the words that came out were barely coherent. "Thorne, the collection, trapped souls, music boxes." He struggled to his feet with Chen's help, looking around wildly for any sign of the entity that had nearly claimed him. But Cornelius Thorne was gone, and with him, the supernatural atmosphere that had filled the shop. What remained was exactly what Marcus had expected to find when he'd first entered: a dusty, abandoned antique shop filled with perfectly ordinary objects that were rapidly succumbing to 17 years of neglect. The music boxes were silent and still, their mechanisms seized with rust and age. The photographs showed nothing but faded images of long-dead strangers in period dress. The grandfather clock had stopped, its pendulum hanging motionless in the still air. "How did you know I was here?" Marcus asked as Chen helped him toward the door, stepping carefully around the debris of collapsed shelving and crumbling artifacts. "Anonymous tip," she replied, not taking her eyes off the treacherous footing. "Someone called in saying they saw lights in here and were worried about a break-in. When we ran the plates on your car parked across the street and you didn't answer your cell phone, we figured we'd better check it out. Good thing, too. This whole place is a death trap. Those support beams look like they could come down any second." As they reached the doorway, Marcus turned back for one final look at the shop that had nearly become his eternal prison. In the harsh glare of the emergency lights, it looked exactly like what it was: a derelict building filled with the detritus of a life that had ended years ago. There was no amber glow, no impossible music, no sense of supernatural presence, just dust and decay, and the sad remnants of someone's obsession with preserving the past. But as Chen guided him toward the waiting ambulance, Marcus caught a glimpse of something that made his blood freeze in his veins. There, in the window of the building directly across from the antique shop, a figure stood watching the emergency response with obvious interest. The figure was tall and thin, dressed in a dark suit that seemed to absorb the flashing lights from the police cars, and though Marcus couldn't make out the face clearly from this distance, he knew with absolute certainty who it was. Cornelius Thorne had not been destroyed or banished. He had simply retreated like a spider withdrawing deeper into its web when disturbed, and he was already selecting his next location, his next collection, his next opportunity to preserve human souls in amber like insects trapped in ancient tree sap. The antique shop on Blackwood Street might be finished, but Thorne himself was eternal, patient, and utterly relentless in his pursuit of the perfect collection. Marcus tried to point out the figure to Deputy Chen, but when he looked back at the window, it was empty. Just another dark pane of glass in another abandoned building on a street full of forgotten dreams and failed businesses. The emergency responders were treating him for shock now, asking questions about how he'd gotten into the locked building, why he'd been there so late at night, whether he'd been drinking or taking any medications that might affect his judgment. He answered their questions as best he could, sticking to the facts that made sense in the normal world. He'd seen lights, investigated what he thought might be a break-in, somehow gotten trapped inside when part of the building collapsed. He didn't mention the music boxes or the photographs or the entity that called itself Cornelius Thorne. Who would believe such a story? Who would understand that some hungers transcended death, that some obsessions could survive the dissolution of the flesh that originally contained them? But as the ambulance carried him away from Blackwood Street, Marcus made himself a promise. He would research Thorne's history more thoroughly, find out how long the man had been collecting souls, and where he might strike next. He would find a way to warn people, to protect them from the subtle call of amber light and impossible music that promised preservation, but delivered only eternal captivity. He had been given a second chance at life, pulled back from the very edge of a fate worse than death, and he would not waste that gift. The antique shop on Blackwood Street was condemned the next morning, its structural integrity deemed too compromised for safe entry. The building was demolished within a week, its contents buried under tons of rubble and concrete that would, the city planners assured everyone, prevent any future access to the site. A small park was planned for the location, with benches and flower beds and a playground where children could laugh and play in the sunlight. But sometimes late at night when the moon was dark and the street lamps seemed dimmer than usual, residents of the neighborhood reported seeing amber lights glowing faintly from beneath the pavement, and hearing, if they listened very carefully, the distant sound of music boxes playing melodies that had never been written for human ears. The lights never lasted long, and the music was always just at the edge of perception, easy to dismiss as imagination, or the settling of old foundations, or the wind moving through construction equipment. Marcus knew better. He knew that Cornelius Thorne was still out there, still collecting, still preserving human souls in vessels of wood and metal and glass. And he knew that someday, when the conditions were right and his hunger grew too great to ignore, Thorne would find a new location for his collection, a new antique shop perhaps, or maybe a museum, or an estate sale in a grand old house where the shadows gathered thick in the corners and the past seemed more real than the present. And when that day came, Marcus would be ready. He would be watching, waiting, prepared to fight back against the amber light and the impossible music and the seductive promise of eternal preservation, because he had learned something in that terrible shop on Blackwood Street, something that Thorne would never understand despite his centuries of collecting human essences. The most precious thing about life is not its preservation, but its impermanence. The knowledge that every moment is finite makes each one infinitely valuable, and no collection, no matter how carefully curated, could ever capture that essential truth. The human soul cannot be preserved because it is not meant to be preserved. It is meant to burn bright and brief and beautiful, leaving behind only memories and the changes it made in the world during its brief passage through time. And that, Marcus realized as he watched the sun rise over a city full of living people pursuing their own finite dreams, was exactly as it should be.